All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Behavioral Economics NYC. I'm Brett, one of your organizers. We also have Noreen in the living room next to the cat condo. We'll see if the cat makes an appearance during the presentation. I don't know if Frank is here, but our mission in this meetup is to welcome everyone with an interest in behavioral economics to get together, learn about the theory and practical, especially practical applications in an accessible and in a free format. Our ground rules are respectful and thoughtful dialogue. And when we're in person, we expect each other to clean up after ourselves. But since you're in your homes or offices, you're welcome to keep it as neat and unhygienic as you wish. That's all fine. Okay, so our agenda is, well, we're just gonna get right to it. We are recording. If you have a concern about being recorded, then don't say anything. Turn off your camera. But if you're fine with it, please turn your camera on. Please interact with Chris. He loves talking and interacting. So please keep your camera on. I'll tell you as an educator, there's few things worse than just seeing a bunch of black, boxes with names in it. Yeah, okay. So I'm really happy to introduce Chris Butler, the guy in the blue shirt there, in daylight, because he's now on the left coast. And he's also, I'm happy to say, a longtime member of the meetup of Behavioral Economics NYC. He is, let's see, he describes himself as a chaotic, good product manager, writer, and speaker. I guess by that, we also know that he's into D&D. We could talk about that, I suppose. He facilitates critical decision-making for teams that build new and innovative products. He focuses on bias, uncertainty, randomization, and I suppose that means noise too. Right? I'd love to talk about that a little bit. To build robust and resilient teams. He has 20 years of product management leadership experience at Microsoft, Waze, Kayak, Facebook Reality Labs, and he's now the AVP head of product operations at Cognizant, where he PMs the PM experience. He's also an associate professor at the Arts Center College of Design. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, I just started the session this spring teaching Interaction Design 3, which is mostly around user research.
Congratulations.
So Thank you.
You and Noreen have a lot in common then. Okay, and he's here to talk to us about better decision-making through randomness. Please join me in welcoming Chris. So you could unmute and clap, or just make this sort of gesture in the camera. Okay, and Chris, did you want to have questions as we go, or save till the end?
Yeah, I'm happy to take questions as we go. I'll also try to reserve a little bit of time for questions at the end too. So feel free to do whatever makes most sense.
Right.
But okay. Yeah, if you want to raise your hand, Brett, if you could help me keep an eye out for people that want to raise their hand, and I'll take a little pause. Definitely.
Absolutely. If my cat enters the screen, we'll take some pause. But yeah, you can raise your hand and ask it verbally, or you can put it in the chat, and I'll do my best to interpret the questions as they come. So
that's great.
I'm going to stop my screen sharing so that Chris can.
Great.
Do his.
Yep. Awesome. So yeah, thank you everybody for the time today. As Brett just said, we're going to be talking about better decision making through randomness. And my name is Chris Butler. This is my email address if you want to get in contact with me for any reason. ChrisBot is my Twitter handle if you want to say nice things about me on the internet. I am not a behavioral economist. I do not have a degree in kind of psychology or economics, but I guess I've been doing a lot of work, like Brett said, around product management, and I've just started to find that when working with cross-functional teams, when trying to figure out how to build the right thing rather than the thing right, though I think there's some implications there too. I found randomness to be an interesting way to really help us make better decisions. And so because we're talking about randomness, we're actually going to add some randomness to this talk as well. And the way I'm going to do this, and this is the first time I'm doing this, by the way, so things may just blow up horrifically at a certain point. But what we're going to do is we're going to randomize our session. And we're going to do that in 2 different ways. One, I'm going to randomize the order of this talk by section, and I'm going to use dice to actually do this. So I have a 20-sided die, and I may or may not be into Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games, but I do have a 20-sided die. And then the second thing is that I'm going to use a web tool that for some random interval between 2 and 4 minutes, it's going to ding at me, and I'm going to have to draw a card from this deck where I'm going to have to answer the prompt that is on this. And I have 2 different decks. I have one which is called Triggers, which are basically like user-centric questions. And then I have a deck of Oblique strategies that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. And I'll probably just like alternate between these 2 as far as provocations. So yeah, that's what we're going to do for the next about 45 minutes to an hour. But like I said, I'm going to try to keep some time open for that. So what I'm going to do first is let's actually, here, I'm going to show you that I'm actually rolling a dice in the first place. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually find, there's 6 different sections to this. And so for decision making, we will get a 19. Probably, we're going to go from highest to lowest, by the way. So randomness gets a 3. Oh, that's a tough one to do last. Oh my gosh, divergence is going to go at 2. Converging is 17. And then resilience is a 6. And then finally, storytelling is 9. So I'm going to be jumping around a bit. What I kind of think is interesting about this approach is that there's a way that I could think about doing the narrative of this entire discussion, but I think that sometimes certain pieces of it may work before others, but I don't know until that moment that I actually try it, that it may work in different orders. And so that's why I'm trying this out. And then the second thing, like I said, I'm going to be using this random timer between about 2 and 4 minutes to actually prompt me with a card. And so I'll stop the presentation at that moment. Whatever current topic we've been talking about, I'll draw a card and then do a prompt. So let's get that started. So the first thing that I'm actually going to do, which is decision making is the highest. So it actually is the first thing that I'd usually be talking about. But decision making in this particular case, right? What I'm really talking about is this idea that we all have many, many decisions, some of which are really important, some of which are just like daily things like what I'm going to have for lunch. But there's kind of a common way that people think about decision making, which is that we need to identify what is the decision, which is like, what is this question or action that we want to take or problem we need to solve a lot of the time. We need to then gather that information, which then includes alternatives. We need to in some way weigh between all those different things. We'll choose one of them, we'll take action, and sometimes we'll look backwards. What I would say is that this is probably more steps than most people go through when it comes to regular decision making. But it's I think very important to look at these different steps that may actually happen subconsciously in some ways, and sometimes emotion may drive a lot of these things, right? But what I think is interesting is that when we think about any of these steps, we're actually wrong for a lot of them. And in some way, somehow we're wrong at almost every single moment of our life, right? We don't have all the information we want, things like that. And so, what I wanted to use this first section to really talk about is like, what are all the different ways that we're actually wrong? And so the first one is biases. And so when we talk about biases, right, there's a huge number of these biases that are identified. They tend to be where we are in some way taking an action that is like a shortcut for us to be able to understand a situation, but may not actually give us the most quote unquote rational like outcome in that particular case. These things have evolved over millions of years, sometimes in the very basic level in the way that we end up reacting to the world, but also these end up being shortcuts or models that we end up using to actually help us when it comes to like reducing information, deciding what to remember, a bunch of things. And so there's both biological and cognitive reasons why these biases exist. And what's interesting is that, Thinking Fast and Slow is a book that popularized a lot of these discussions around biases. And in particular, I think a really hard one to understand is this idea of like the blind spot bias. And so people are often unaware of their biases and can readily spot the same biases in the judgments of others. And so this was actually the topic of last time's meetup. So I was like really excited to see the blind spot bias be discussed. And so that's why I ended up talking to Brett about maybe talking here about the idea of randomization. The next thing that can really cause us to be wrong in some way are assumptions. And one of those, what I mean by assumptions are kind of models that we have developed over time to help us deal with the situation. And this is a paper that came out back in 1986 around something called dominant logic, which the theory around dominant logic is really that you will then develop models that have, as you've become successful. And then in companies that are successful, when they then try to, one, continue in time to the future, look at servicing new customers, look at expanding to new markets, trying to create new solutions, they end up using the old mental models to that new situation, which may be incorrect sometimes. And this actually happens a lot when it comes to senior leadership within organizations, where they have gotten to the point that they have based on the past mental models that they've used. And because of that, that means that they then apply those models to potentially inappropriate situations. And that could cause them to then reduce the variance of ideas that are allowed to actually make it to the very top. Because they, just got the first of the prompts. And so let's see, I'm going to choose a card out of this trigger deck, basically. And so the random card is, what if the idea made people feel loved? And so I think this is a hard one, I think, for when talking about dominant logic. But I think one of the ways that it ends up being applied to this, like how would people feel if they knew they were loved? I mean, I think one of the biggest issues I've found with like being inside of an organization that does have a lot of very successful people at the top is that it seems like our ideas are not actually being taken seriously, and that our judgments or concerns are not actually being integrated into the way that decision making takes place. And so I think one of the biggest problems with like that I've seen with certain types of organizational issues ends up being that people that are considered to be successful, they're continuing to perpetuate, whereas other people that are not considered to be successful may be right or actually discarded when it comes to the way that they may understand something. So that's my attempt at integrating that particular card. So let's start the timer again. So getting back to dominant logic, I think this is like a really interesting concept to basically like when we look at the idea of what are our preconceived models that we're using, we don't always know, right? And this ends up happening in very large organizations where it's kind of like the working set of assumptions that end up being there, they're invisible. And so, Rich Bettis, I've met him a couple of times. He was a university professor, I believe in North Carolina. He talked about this idea of like dominant logic bases knowledge, know-how, and skill accumulation into path-dependent pathways that are preferred by dominant logic. And so that's essentially what I was talking about when we end up removing variance from the possible things that we're considering, is based on this idea that we have assumptions about these models. And in particular, in this manner, variance and exploration of alternatives are then suppressed. And so assumptions end up doing this type of reduction of variance, which is really bad when you're trying to do something that's novel or new. The next thing is around certainty, right? And so this was a book that was kind of interesting a couple of years ago about being certain. And in particular, it's that we believe that certainty is something that comes out of the fact that we are, being logical and that we're using a bunch of evidence to then decide that we should be certain about something. And the reality is that when we look at the brain scanning of this type of feeling, is that it's closer to an emotion. And so feeling correct or certain isn't a deliberate conclusion or a conscious choice. It's a mental sensation that happens. And so I think there's still an awful lot more to learn about this, but this idea of that certainty is something that is actually more emotional than it is logical, I think is a really important thing to realize and understand about when we feel certain about something. The next problem that can come up for decision-making is really around groupthink. And so groupthink is something, as described in this Applied Critical Thinking Handbook, which was the Army's kind of like formerly called red teaming handbook. So groupthink really refers to a deterioration of mental efficiency, reality testing, and moral judgment that results from in-group pressures. So whenever you see something like us versus them, the idea of that we will do something as part of our in-group that may not be the most rational choice again, is really what groupthink ends up talking about. And in particular, Irving Janis, who's a psychologist, talks about group norms and the social pressures to conform to them, are in tension with the need for a staff to consider alternatives during decision-making, right? This is another type of a thing that happens as teams work longer with each other. They end up being in more alignment, which means they think more alike, and there's benefits to that. But there's also problems that it means that we stop considering as many things as we would have otherwise. So, all right. I will now draw from the Oblique strategy card deck. And so this one is, who should be doing this job and how would they do it? And so I think talking about worrying about groupthink, I think is very interesting, because I think groupthink ends up usually benefiting leaders inside of organizations, right? Because they're usually the ones that are creating incentive structures and goals for the entire group. Culture ends up also kind of maneuvering that group to be closer and closer together, because people just naturally dislike having disagreement or arguments, things like that. And so I think in some way, that incentive is really benefiting this idea of groups and the way that they work. So anyways, I'll keep going after that. So now, the next thing is this idea of like lack of diversity. And so there's a really great article in HBR about kind of diverse teams and how they feel uncomfortable. And the reason why they actually perform better. And so I think this is related to something with regards to adversarial thinking and the way that we end up doing a better job when we're challenged in some way. And this is very much related to groupthink, right? So in this particular study, though, what they found was that on a homogeneous team, and this means even just people that look alike, right? So they did just basically by assembling teams of people that were, of similar kind of like a bunch of white people, a mixed group of like Black and white people, things like that. And what they found was that people will believe they readily understand each other and that collaboration flows smoothly, giving the sensation of progress. But the reality was that adding an outsider, even someone that just looks different than everybody else, more than doubled their chance at arriving at a correct solution. But it felt harder to work because there was not as many assumptions that people had about keeping things in some way like in alignment. The next thing is that there's also this problem with an uncertain future. And so inside of an uncertain future, I really like Gerd Geigerziner, which I always mispronounce his last name. But the more uncertain the criterion is, the smaller sample size available, the more a cognitive system needs to protect itself from one kind of error, which is variance, over another, which would be bias. And so we generally tend to like being more biased towards things we think will work versus this idea of being open to more variance. And so there are many times where understanding the variance of options is much better than us just going down the path. So maybe even the analogy to like the fox and the hedgehog is that we end up as organizations and being more like the hedgehog than the fox, when sometimes the fox may be more beneficial. And then finally, I like to talk about the lack of rigor. And so, this is another Gergeziner quote, but he talks about this a lot, that a professor from Columbia University had an offer from a rival university, could not make up his mind whether to accept, reject, or stay. And so a colleague took him aside and said, "What's the problem? Just maximize your expected utility. You always write about doing this." And what he said in response was that, come on, this is serious. And so I think even people that are really great at decision-making or lucky at decision-making in a lot of ways, they do not apply the same amount of rigor that many decision experts say they should be applying to that. And so if we go back to this stepwise thing by UMass Amherst, we can find that there's many cases here where bias will end up causing problems for us. Assumptions, lack of diversity, lack of rigor, like just taking the action rather than actually identifying what is the decision we're trying to make, I think ends up being very problematic. So I did see a raised hand just go up. And so I'm happy to pause for a second.
Hi, I'm just wondering if you could slow down your
sure.
speech, that would help. Thank you.
Oh, sure, no problem. Thank you. I tend to talk very fast. I listen to all my podcasts 2x, so I think that's probably part of the problem. But yeah, so I think, when we look at all of the different ways that we have problems. Oh, all right. So I'm going to draw another card from the user-centric deck. And this one is, what if the idea helped people explore the world. So I think if we were to think about this idea of the way that we end up being wrong is that we are way over-optimized for things that are near us and for not only in time, but also location, but also people, and just knowledge in general. And so I think this idea of, one of the aspects of I found to be very interesting is including people from different backgrounds. So kind of in this theme of explore the world, that there's many different ways that people end up making decisions too. And so even though these steps may be fairly common for people, I think it's really interesting to understand what are the different ways that we end up considering the possible options. And I think that that's why this concept of diversity is so valuable in some way. So I'll start the timer again. Great. So, what can we do about being wrong? And I think, this is a image from a particular blog that talks about like bias, debiasing. And the part that I always get stuck on is this idea of developing the awareness of the bias. And so we, talked about this blind spot bias last time that we met. And I think, that last talk does a really great job of kind of outlining all of the foundational research around it. But that blind spot bias means that there's a lot of times that we won't know that we're being biased in some way. We don't know that we have bad assumptions. We don't know that we're not being diverse enough in the group of people that are considering things. And so this is, going back to a quote by Kahneman, is it's really hard to change other people's behavior. And it's even harder to change our own. It's not simple at all. And so, I think this shows that we need to stand outside of our current mindsets in some way, but we are actually trapped by those mindsets at the same time. And so that's the end of the you are wrong. And so now I'm going to go on to the next one, which is around convergence. So let me go down to that section. And don't worry, we'll get to all of these. So no, so not divergence, convergence. So convergence, I use this as a concept in the realm of, say, design thinking, double diamond, all the terminology around how are we diverging, so collecting as much possible, in the case of decision making, all the different possibilities that are out there. And then convergence is about how do we now make a decision. And one of the most interesting ways that I found randomness to help with that type of decision is really around the coin flip. And so there's two things that are happening here. I think one is that a lot of people use coin flips to make decisions between people, especially when there's disagreement. Now, I do think there are problems with coin flips. So for example, the idea of a coin flip is just saying that there's only two options, when the reality is there's potentially many options that are there. And then secondarily, the coin flip has an interesting effect that it's actually closing down possibilities when the coin is in the air. And that means that then people have a feeling about what they actually want. And so I've used coin flips and actually dice rolls if we're talking about multiple options, that when I'm talking to someone that's having a hard time making a decision, I'll either roll a die or flip a coin and I'll say, okay, well, so I just did this, heads this, tails that, or if we have, say, 4 options, I roll a 4-sided die and I say, like, here's all the different options. And before I tell them what the result is, I actually ask them what deep down inside do they feel is actually the right thing to do, or is the thing that they actually want to happen. So I think there's something interesting about this idea of like playing with human psychology when it comes to the way that expectations of a decision being taken out of your hands and how we actually emotionally feel about that. Now, I've used this in the case of, and so one of the things that I think is really interesting about constraints and about the way we change constraints comes from this post by Derek Silvers, where it talks about how he was, when he was first learning. All right, so I'm going to do a provocation from the Oblique strategies. So reverse. Reverse. I think the reverse of this like convergence thing that we're talking about when it comes to coin, like the coin flipping and the way that it ends up making someone feel. I think the reverse is that, yeah, it's interesting. I guess like the reverse is being on the other side of the coin flip. So the concept of you're in this like high state of uncertainty about between the time that you flip the coin and you've learned the outcome. The reverse, I guess, of that would be that you tell someone maybe what is the decision that they have to make and see how they feel that way. So I think it still maybe gets at that idea of like you're taking something out of someone's hands as far as a decision, but there's a difference when it comes to certainty and uncertainty that might be interesting there. So that's what I would say about that. So getting back to this example about Derek Silver's, where he was learning how to do both piano and singing, and as a way to teach a breadth of skills around singing and playing piano, Derek's teacher would ask him to sing it twice as fast or twice as slow, or like Bob Dylan, or like he was just woken up at 4 a.m. by a friend, and many other scenarios. And the reason why that's really interesting is that realizing the initial choice you made, so like the constraints that you've initially put on the way you should play this, brings all types of, weathered wisdom and insight into your business. And the way that I've interpreted this is that there are many different ways that we assume something should start to happen. So those assumptions, that dominant logic again. And we automatically apply it to the way that we do something intuitively. And so a method that I've used in this particular case is to actually start to apply different types of constraints randomly to a project to see how that changes the value that we believe is coming out of that. And so this is something that is called World Warps by Anchor from Hop Labs. It's something he talked to me about a very long time ago, but I think I want to give him credit around this because I couldn't really put it into words until he talked about it. And what this is that when you are actually trying to make a decision about something, varying the constraints on top of that decision in some ways randomly helps you do that better. And so, for example, what if we had to solve this and we only had a month to do it? Or if we only had a weekend to deploy, or if there were no technical resources, or if I only gave you X, like small amount of money, if I gave you lots of money, and if we were part of like a very large tech company. And so all of these different random constraints end up getting at like, what is the value we're trying to get out of it? And can we still get that value even when the kind of assumptions that we have about the way things work are different in some way? And so that's the end of Convergence. The next highest one was storytelling. So I'm going to go there right now. So storytelling, I also talk about this as like narrative, but when I mean storytelling here, I mean that we're talking about this concept of how do we talk about with, say, customers, what we're doing, how do we talk about narrative internal to the organization? And this comes from a meme that I found a long time ago. It's actually, the tweet's deleted at this point. I tried to look it up today, but it's this idea of like how you do decision-making. And at the very top, it's this idea of like all the very official ways that you end up doing decision-making, which includes like talking to experts, a debate, maybe doing some type of voting system. And then we go into this world of like dice rolls and then dice rolls as interpretation by a shaman. And we get to kind of like Plato from that point. But what I think is like where this really started to lead me is this idea of kind of mysticism and divination and things like that as a way to interpret the world, but not so much as kind of it being mystical or it being in some way prediction. And so this is a really great article about called The Uncertainty Machine, which is about the I Ching. And the I Ching is basically a kind of fortune telling, but also in some way, a way to think about the problems you have or a problem that you're faced with. And what you end up doing is you end up drawing a bunch of sticks, and then that turns into a hexagram that then basically is a particular kind of quote passage that can be interpreted a lot of different ways. So it's a lot like kind of horoscopes in the sense that a horoscope is usually written in such a way that you can interpret it a bunch of different ways. And the writer of this article, that's like a real kind of, whoops. Sorry about that. Oh, here, I'm going to pause for a second. All right. So I'm going to now do trigger card. And the trigger card is, what if you gave importance to user benefits? And so, yeah, I think like some of the user benefits here when it comes to the I Ching, right, is it's a way for you to get a way to interpret things outside of the way that you're actually thinking about them. And it's a different lens on top of that. And actually, I'm going to talk about this in just a second when it comes to this article, and in particular, this quote. So it's maybe like very kind of serendipitous. But the I Ching prompts me to go beyond false certainties and to create new and unexpected possibilities. And this is the author of that article. And so the way he uses it is more like a machine for adding more uncertainty to your world and being able to break out of whatever certainties you had at that moment. And so, I've been known to like take things way too far. And so what I've started to do, and this is maybe a little bit of like a conference trick that I do while at the bar, is think about the way that using something like the tarot deck, and I have one here too, that if we want to, we can play with later in the presentation. But starting to think about it from the standpoint that these are ways that we can interpret things, right? And it's a way for us to interpret something that has some amount of randomness that is not exactly the way we would expect to interpret it. And so I've actually used this is called the cross spread. And I've used it when thinking about the idea of like, how do we reinterpret the problems that we're coming up against when it comes to product? And so if you draw these things, and by the way, like a lot of the imagery, especially in the writer deck, ends up being something that you can interpret. There are actual meanings to some of the cards based on these like tarot books that are out there. I am definitely not an expert on those things. But what I think is interesting is that drawing these different cards and using also some of the kind of symbols of whether things are upside down or not, and which means kind of reversal or not. This idea of saying, I'm going to now draw 5 different ways to interpret what is going on with your product. And it's going to be about a way to interpret the present, right? What is the question that you have, the past and future, and then the potential. And what happens with this is that even though I am literally doing something that is just interpreting their question through the symbols that are on these cards, people come to different understandings of their situation than they would have otherwise. So I'm definitely not, in any way a mentalist or a fortune teller, but I think these tools are really, really interesting in being able to help people reimagine kind of through very random techniques. So that's storytelling. The next thing after that is actually around resilience. And so let me go up there really quickly. So resilience, when we talk about the concepts around resilience.
Hey, Chris, there was a question in
yeah,
the
sure.
text, if you want to address that now or later.
Yeah, go for it.
Jen, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, yeah, sorry about that. This is actually, I think, a section or two before, but I was just wondering, I know that there was a slide that you had on there about like the different questions that you might ask in order to vary the constraints. So I would love to know your perspective on, are there like right ways, or do you have a framework in mind when it comes to sort of how do you vary those constraints when applying it to a decision or choice? I know the questions that you have up there are mostly related to product, but just from a general framework perspective.
I mean, I think it's interesting to understand additional viewpoints around like what are other people dealing with as far as constraints. And so you can see here that these are all kind of pointing at different situations for the team. So like had a month to build and deploy, that's like about the average time that a more traditional Scrum style sprint would have been, right? Or a weekend is like what a startup would try to do. Or no technical resources is this idea of no code, or a product manager only trying to do something. And the difference between, maybe boot, and I can't break my rules, so I'm gonna just draw one oblique strategy card here to answer your question too.
We'll
the inconsistency. It's what?
We'll give you a pass.
It's okay, the inconsistency. So I think like this, folding in the term inconsistency in here, is that you have a particular way that you're looking at it based on the way that your current situation is. And then if the situation was different, and that could be through different people's viewpoints. So like there's a person I used to work with named Greg, and I'm blanking on his last name right now, but he wrote the book kind of This Might Get Me Fired, which is a book about entrepreneurship. And one of the things that he would do as a workshop is he would talk about, like, if you're a very large company, what are all the benefits you have as a large company, and where are all the disadvantages? And then for the same thing is like, in your industry, what are the advantages and disadvantages as a startup that you would have, right? And so that idea of like, how is it that you could in some way reinterpret that constraint if you were a very large company? What would the startup do in this case? And vice versa, as a startup, what would a large company do in this case? I think it's those types of constraints where you're taking a different viewpoint of a different person or group that could be in your same situation. Now, I think that it is still very interesting to just take these randomized. And so, I think there's something interesting about the way that you end up creating decks around these types of things. So like the way that this trigger card deck was created, I actually have written a deck of cards for like machine learning specific things. how you decide what is the working set of randomness is a really interesting question. And I think it has to be out there enough. And it also depends on the patience of the people that are there. Because like I've used oblique strategies with like people before, and they just think it's ridiculous. But if I use something like trigger cards, it actually is more geared towards user-centric stuff. So I think that, and so they're like, oh, of course, this makes sense. We're talking about user-centric things. And so I think there's something about like expectations and I'd even just mention like one of the things I took out of the slides, but this idea of like using randomness in a hidden way for yourself, I think is a really interesting thing to do. So like all those constraints that we just talked about, there's probably a way to like create a list of constraints that you could be going through on a regular basis. And picking one of those at random to ask as an intelligent question in a conference, like a meeting, could be something that you could do as well. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, it definitely does. Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Cool. All right, let's get back into any other questions I can help answer before I keep going. I'm not looking at the chat, by the way, so.
Yeah, you know what? Just so I don't forget. So
yeah,
it'd be great if you have the links to the articles that you're.
Yes, I will send out. I'll send out
the
slides after this, and then also a link to all the articles. And so yeah, I'll get all this information out to everybody.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's get back into resilience. So when I talk about resilience here, I mean not only for say organizations, right, or groups, but also for individuals. And so one of the first ones I want to talk about is really organizational resiliency. And so if people are familiar with something called Chaos Monkey, it was a really groundbreaking technology that was created by Netflix to be able to test reliability of their site. And what it would essentially do is that during a certain time period, it would just randomly take certain machines offline. And this actually turned into a whole practice of something called chaos engineering or site reliability engineering for people that didn't like chaos engineering as a term. But essentially would look at resiliency as the entire system when certain things are dropped out. And this is, I think this comes from kind of, it's a automated way to do things like red teaming, which again, red teaming comes from this idea of blue versus red, which many people think it comes from the United States, but it's actually during the Prussian wars, where you're trying to be what is the attacker, or in some cases, like when it comes to Chaos Monkey, it's not even an attacker, it's just the randomness of the world is constantly trying out the things against your group. And so Chaos Monkey turned into this whole chaos engineering thing, which then, there's a chaos conf that this happened back in 2019. And Dave Renzen is someone that works for something called SRE, which is Site Reliability Engineering, which is essentially chaos engineering, but for Google. And at Google, he wrote this talk, which again, I'll link to. I think it's really interesting. There's a bunch of other techniques in here, but one I wanted to talk about in particular, he really focuses in on like chaos engineering, but for people systems. And his whole premise is about the fact that because groups of people are complex systems in some way, we don't always know what will happen if certain adverse effects impact those people or individuals inside of that organization. And so the one I wanted to talk about here is this thing he calls the Wheel of Staycation, where on some time frame, and I've seen it on a weekly basis, beginning of the week, someone is chosen to randomly take a staycation. And what that means is that for that entire day, they turn on their out of office, they shut off all their messaging, and they basically work on whatever they've been trying to work on for however long. And then what you see what ends up failing. And the reason why this is really interesting is because, like, why do they do this? They do it to find hidden information, single point of failures in their company. And so there, of course, is a proctor that will be able to step in if something is going really bad. But I think when we talk about resiliency in organizations, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to understand how will this organization fail, and can we in some way either add slack to allow for more resiliency, or do we have to find alternative plans, or do we need to plan out an actual response in these cases? And this is used to kind of an opposite effect when we talk about the way that finance institutions work. And so for people that end up doing trades or other types of like outlays, they'll actually require some amount of time for them to take off. And this was actually in reverse to what used to happen, where no one ever took any time off. But what they found is that if people were not taking time off, their trades wouldn't settle. And so they'd never find out that these problems were there. And so this is something that, from a resilience of the organization standpoint, ends up really being helpful to detect problems in the organization while it's happening. And so now I'm going to pick one out of the user-centric card deck. What if the idea had to be useful? Yeah, I mean, I think this is already useful, right? I think this concept of how do we find, what we refer to in the tech world as the bus problem, right? If someone were to suddenly disappear, what does that mean for all the problems? I think that's incredibly useful. And I think it's very valuable. So this is something that is used during financial institutions to actually find the opposite of what we're talking about, which is that if someone is there, are they doing harm to the group in some way? Then I want to talk about individual resiliency. And so this is something they're called IDK, I don't know cards. And it's actually by this person named Von Tan, who wrote a book called The Uncertainty Mindset. And one of the things that he really identified, this book is really interesting. I definitely highly recommend it, but it's a book about very high-end dining restaurants and their R&D groups. And it talks about how do they build the environment to allow for very innovative things to continuously happen. And there's a bunch of things that he goes into about like why those types of institutions and how they set up the environment to constantly be very innovative. But a part that is really hard for people is when dealing with uncertainty is they need to get used to uncertainty. And so he created this deck of cards. And what's interesting about this deck of cards is that it has a bunch of provocations that you would need to draw and then you would need to go off and do. And it's usually things that are fairly uncomfortable for people. So one of them may be in a meeting with people working for you, admit openly, not knowing something which they expect you to know, right? That's incredibly uncomfortable for many people. But it's something that as you can get more used to the uncertainty of the situation, you start to burn away this belief that things are certain. And this is very much related to the way that, say, product managers in the industry, like when I started at Microsoft, we used to say that for the first 2 years of a program manager's life, they weren't really worth that much. And the reason was because they still believed that there was like a sure thing, and that if you had planned out things to 100% of the capability, it would go right. And so this intuition that's built up over time is something that does take experience. And I think there's lots of ways to short circuit this. One of the things, especially around uncertainty mindsets, I think is this idea of how do you push yourself into uncertain spaces. Now, I think a question I have for Von Tan in particular, all right, and so I'm going to draw from the Oblique Strategies deck this time. This one is, what would your closest friend do? So my closest friend, John, he would actually probably rail against something like this, right? He actually doesn't really enjoy uncertainty very much. But what I think is interesting is maybe looking at it from the standpoint that he and I find different types of uncertainty, either hard or easy. Like I tend to be very, very specific about my calendaring, my calendar, because I feel like I like live and die by that and I forget things all the time. Versus I think that his certainty would be much more around kind of communication certainty, things like that. So I don't know, I think it's interesting that everybody does have slightly different uncertainties that they're concerned with. And I think this is related to what Von Tan is talking about these. And I've asked him this question is, how much is there domain specific uncertainty, right? I'm very okay with uncertainty when it comes to products now. But like I said, I'm very not okay with uncertainty around my calendar. And so he came up with really 4 principles for training productive discomfort, right? Which he basically means like dealing with uncertainty. So it requires you to gradually build up to it. So kind of like constantly upping your dosage until you're good at it. It should be done intentionally by putting yourself into these different experiences. You should do it repeatedly, right? So it's something that is something you probably get good at over time and may actually fall off if you don't do a lot. And then, this is something that you should choose to better yourself, because if someone else forces you to do it, you will end up just like really disliking the experience. So I think there's this idea of like agency and autonomy that ends up going to it, but I think there's an awful lot to learn still about the way that personal resilience is built. So that's it for resilience. The next one is actually randomness. So we'll go up there to randomness. And here we go. So from the standpoint of randomness, right, this is usually something where, and I'm not going to talk about kind of causality and the fact that what I am talking about when I talk about randomness is that as human beings, we do not have access to all information. So that means that things that may be causal right? We don't, and have high amounts of uncertainty because we don't have view into that information, ends up meaning that we see things as random, or that we can never really fully understand the causal chain of events that led to some type of event or outcome. And that's what I mean by randomness in a lot of ways. And you know, unfortunately, randomness is one of those things that if we just take a look at, say, something like static, right? That type of randomness, that type of kind of one-time pad, all those different things when we talk about randomness really ends up being garbage when it comes to the way that we interpret things as human beings. But I would say that when we try to be random as human beings, we're not very good at it, right? This was actually a study where they asked people to pick a number at random, and most of the time they picked 7, and they very rarely picked 1 and 10. And so unfortunately, we are all very biased, right? And so what does that mean for the way that we end up talking about randomness? So I see that there's 2 ways that random really help us. One is by a walk through possibilities. And what do I mean by that? I want to talk about this book, Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned. And so this is a book that's more of a machine learning book that talks about this concept of novelty-based search by Kenneth Stanley and Joel Lehman, but it really focuses in on a website that's called PickBreeder. And PickBreeder is this website where you would be presented with a field. All right, so I'm going to pick from the user-centric deck. What if the idea brought people together? So actually, the way that this particular topic brought people together is that with the PickBreeder, it was on the internet so that it allowed everybody to actually contribute. And so what would happen is you'd see a field of these images, and then and these fields of images would be presented to thousands of people while they're online, and you would choose the one that you thought was most interesting or most aesthetically pleasing. And the fitness function, which was like what humans liked, was not very well specified. And so, you know, from that perspective, you would end up getting a bunch of these things, and it used genetic algorithms to then, plus the fitness factor of humans saying that whether they like a particular image out of a field of, say, 9 images, to then evolve over many basically generations. And so this meant that things that were on the left-hand side, like that kind of oval with black and white, looks kind of shiny, eventually it turned into a skull, or these 2 things that looks like a vase or 2 faces eventually turned into a butterfly. But what's really interesting about it is that it almost seemed random based on the way that these things were evolving over time, and no one could actually see the end result. And so from that perspective, right, we were doing a walk through the space based on some unknown kind of fitness factor, which was novelty, I guess. And you were getting to places that you would not have expected to. And this book about why greatness cannot be planned and kind of the objective as a deceit, I think is a really great book. But I'm not going to go into too much. I can link to a talk where I go into more about this and its like impact on uncertainty from a product management perspective. But this really inspired me to do something when I was living in Hong Kong, and I was working for a VC group called Horizon Ventures. And so they did a lot of work with Shantou University. And we were asked to basically create a hackathon to get engineering students and design students to work better together. And so from here, this idea of like, we didn't know exactly the right way to actually build out these teams. We didn't want to specify exactly what they would be doing. We ended up using randomness with the inspiration of how do we allow for different levels of fitness to be included here by one, randomizing the people in who they were kind of in a group with. So there were no friends in groups, but we would always balance it with the number of designers and engineers. And then we used a system by which we would create a prompt for them, kind of like Ludum Dare is a game jam where you basically have a concept for a game that you have to then hack together in about 48 hours. So we use that concept to now basically say, all right, you have to create this prompt. And the prompt included like a famous person. It included an interaction because there was this like Arduino Grove things that had like both a sensor and an actuator. They had to use it in a particular style. And what we were able to get out of this hackathon was something that we couldn't have expected. And so this is an example of like a diorama box where it was Steve Jobs. And I think if you moved your hand over it, the ping pong ball would like jump back and forth, basically. And so these are things that like were really weird, but they were really amazing in what we were able to get out of these kind of, you know, second-year students that were working together for the first time over the course of about 24 hours. So what this really took me to is that there really is like a value in searching the solution space by using these types of randomization techniques. The second thing I want to talk about is this idea of randomness through annealing. And so annealing is originally comes from the standpoint of like, how do you start to heat up metal very fast, let it cool down very slowly so that it becomes more malleable, and it gives you different properties. Simulated annealing is something that has been used to be able to find the optimal solution, not only in machine learning, but other types of methods. And what I think is most interesting about this is that it uses randomization methods from the standpoint of whether you feel like you need to have like different temperatures and the idea of adding energy or allowing energy to reduce based on how you're finding that function fit. And so this is an example of, all right, here, I'll do a user-centric deck. All right. What if the idea improved health? That's an interesting one. So that I think there's something interesting about this annealing method when it comes to like when you're first getting started with something like say dieting or even working out, you want to try a lot of different things. And that's maybe a good example of like annealing, right? Like you're at the very beginning of your search, you're trying lots and lots of different things and trying to now judge like where that is on the fitness landscape. And so literally when it comes to fitness, it would be, does it give me the strength I want? Do I feel tired afterwards? Do I enjoy it? Does it help me reduce fat, right? And then as you start to find things that are of less error or higher fitness, you end up basically fixing on those things. What I think is really interesting about annealing from the standpoint of this now hill climbing is that there's also the idea that you can add energy to an annealing to be able to start to reset it so that so you can completely reset, which is you start from a completely different place and then do the same randomization process, which is, machine learning tends to use something very similar when doing epochs of training and then for each of those epochs. The second thing is that I think when you end up focusing on adding energy to your experience, it helps you jump out of local maxima. And so I've found that this idea of kind of how do you start searches usually earlier in a way that allows you to do that, I think is really helpful. Now, the problem that I struggle with a lot of the time is that, how do we actually apply this to decision-making in some way? And so when it comes to decision-making, there's a really great book about kind of the history of gambling. And I'd say that randomness is maybe one of those things that we first started using at a very, very early time in our development as human beings. And so he was kind of like hypothesizing that one hunter would be talking to another and say, we're going to roll these bones right now. And if it lands short side up, we'll search for game to the south. And if not, we look to the north. And not only was this kind of the beginning of maybe gambling, where they use the same technique to decide who gets more, but at first this idea of we may not always have enough information to make a decision. And so now we use this to not only explore the space, but also to decide when we should be exploring the space more or less. And I think that really gets us to this equation. It's not really an equation, but I guess the way I think about things, and that, yes, noise is garbage. But if we add some type of human perception or interpretation of that garbage, I think we end up getting to less biased and more novel situations. Sometimes, part of the time, but not all the time. And I think this is even true when we start to add more and more people to this and we worry about groupthink. I think the fact that we're adding this type of uncertainty to it actually is very, very valuable. And that's it about randomness. And then finally, I'm going to end with this topic around divergence. And divergence is really where I think besides the hackathon, this was where I started to apply things to product process. And so when I talk about divergence, I mean that we're at the beginning of some type of, say, design thinking or, build, measure, learn, or just any beginning of a project. Usually during a kickoff, we'll do something called divergence, which is how do we gain as many ideas as possible right now? How do we get as many ideas down? And there's a bunch of techniques that I think create better divergent experiences. And basically getting up on the whiteboard and brainstorming is not one of them. But I think this is like a really, really important activity. And one of these activities that I ended up, all right, so going to draw a Oblique strategies. Try faking it, which was provided by Stuart Brand. It's interesting that he would say something like try faking it. Yeah, I guess like how would you fake divergence is by probably, at least one way to fake it is to prime everybody ahead of time. right? And that's maybe getting to my point about how brainstorming is, especially when you have like that highest paid person or senior person or person in a position of power inside of a room, is you're kind of doing this idea of divergence. You're trying to collect ideas, but the reality is that it's going to be guided in such a way that, like, even saying things like, that's not a good idea, or what about this, throwing out the first idea as a person of power ends up really basically faking this idea of divergence. And so, the oblique strategy cards are something that Brian Eno and Schmidt ended up creating. It was like a list on a kind of piece of paper for musicians or writers that suddenly had a block. And I've been using them so far in this presentation because they're kind of like more provocations or things that you should try to do that end up, again, trying to push you into uncomfortable places to actually do something different. And so one of the places, Brian does say, because it would break you out of your rut, it would push you into kind of behavior that wouldn't normally make. And sometimes that was very productive. And I think it's really important here, he says sometimes, right? Randomization can still cause garbage or bad ideas, but I've found that overall it does help in some way. And so one of the ways that I've used these types of cards is in something during a divergent activity called Crazy Eights. And so Crazy Eights are where you fold a piece of paper so that there's 8 sections, and then you get 1 minute per box on that piece of paper to sketch something. And usually this is for kind of sketching interactions, sketching interfaces, maybe even kind of ideas just in general. And this is actually one that I did for a particular project. You can tell my handwriting's really bad. But what I would do to now add randomness to this, so there's already kind of a bit of variance that's done with this, because you do it as a group of people and you present to each other, and that then skews your thinking as time goes on. But what we would do is we would actually include oblique strategy card pulls for every one of these panels. And you can see here that I was writing it down while we were doing it on the whiteboards. And again, that if we had just drawn these things just by themselves as cards, it would be garbage. But because we're now taking the prompt that we have, which is usually like a how might we, or a problem we're trying to solve, we're using all of our past kind of experience and mental models, and then applying this like small variant, like this variable randomness to it, we end up getting very interesting ideas. And I would say almost every single time I've gotten like one idea that I just wouldn't have expected out of myself and out of other people. And this is actually something that we've even taken to the point of view like a board game. So this was there's actually 2 sides to this. One is diverging, one's converging. But it was a board game that we actually created for the Enterprise UX conference as a giveaway. But these things and these experiences end up being very game-like. And the reason is because usually games talk a lot about uncertainty. I think it also tends to lower the stakes a lot of the time, whereas if people were really serious about idea making, you bring all of this past like dominant logic, assumptions, things like that, where it cannot move outside of this box that you're creating. I think when we lower the stakes a little bit, and that's one of the things I think that's interesting about randomness, is it tends to do that because of the way these mechanisms work. It ends up lowering a lot of the concern or rigidness that people may have. So that's the end of Divergence. I'm just going to skip to the end now. And so I think there's a couple things in closing, right? So one, I've given you techniques to really think about randomization for divergence, convergence, resilience, and then storytelling. And then finally, Venkatesh Rao, who's a writer that I really love, written some really interesting books to me, does this really great newsletter called Ribbon Farm, had a post about how do you actually play and not lose at something like 4D chess, which he really sees as like maybe political maneuvering, the concept of how do you do a better job of just like existing in a complex world. And he says very specifically, like, simplify your actions, increase your randomness, complicate the game for the adversary, and try to stay alive. I think this is really good advice. So I would definitely say you should, and we'll do our last card pull. And I'll do it from the user-centric deck. All right. So what if the idea focused on small actions? So I think the thing that I would say that's like a very small action is to get one of these randomization techniques or figure out one of your own and apply it to small decisions that you make in your day-to-day life. And I think there's lots of places where you end up making decisions that, even small ones, like the idea of what to eat for lunch, I think sometimes benefits from randomness. So I'd say start small, right? Just like we were talking about with the IDK cards, how do we actually increase our comfort level with these things is through practice. And so, I don't know, I would pick a space in a domain and a small, low kind of risk or low stakes type of decision that randomness won't actually hurt, a type of decision that is reversible in some way, and start there. And so that is it. Definitely would love to have a discussion right now. And then I have a URL up here, which is a feedback forum where I would love to get your feedback on this, not only just like the way that all the randomness worked, but on the content itself. And it would be a really huge help to me. That's my only ask for you, is really to just fill out this feedback form. So thank you so much for the time today, and would love to talk.
All right, let's put that link into the chat.
Yep, let me get that for you.
And you're not allowed, none of you are allowed to leave the building until you fill out this survey.
Thank you.
The take up on like student surveys is like a 10th when it's online,
Yeah.
versus like half when it's in class.
Absolutely, yeah. So if you have time, but again, like these tend to be more open-ended questions, but I would love to just hear what people's thoughts are about this. And yeah, let's maybe go. Was there any questions in the chat that might be?
Let's see, Peter asks the name of the book.
I will be sending out all the different books that are referenced in here, and then a bunch of links and everything. And yeah, I'll also send out the slides so you can check them out. Yeah. Has anybody? Oh yeah, Heath.
Yes. Hi. Awesome talk. By the way, mine's kind of product specific. I'm actually a former product manager, still like considering going back. But I also want to say I recognize you from the product meetup, another meetup group, and yeah. I was excited to see you. Anyways, I was going to ask, like, just in terms of like product management. I only did it for a little while, but there's so many factors, and like, you touched on a little bit, like, you have some design experience, you have, a lot of it is like understanding your users, like a lot of understanding business principles, but this is a huge part of it, like decision making and sort of like, getting outside of your biases and your assumptions. I'm curious, like, how much of it do you ascribe being a good product manager to this versus the other stuff?
I mean, so I think the surface level for a lot of product management ends up being like what other people see are the artifacts that come out of product management, like roadmaps, prioritization of backlogs, maybe strategic documents, things like that, right? But that's really just the surface level. When we dig into deeper about what product management is really about, I think of it as really 3 key meta activities, one of which is really facilitating decision making. And when I say facilitating very specifically and not making decisions, because it's usually we're depending on other people to have knowledge or experience in things like engineers or designers or user researchers or something like that. And so it's our job to actually put a time box and to figure out when is the right time to actually make the decision. And that could be also to defer to the decision until the last responsible moment, which is like a real options type of thing. The second thing I think is like building alignment through communication. And the third thing is just like embracing uncertainty, right? And I think that there are certain roles that are inside of teams that really are more about uncertainty than certainty. So the types of things that are certainty roles would be like an engineer needs to ship a line of code that goes onto a server somewhere, right? A designer, interaction designer needs to place a button somewhere inside of like a flow. A salesperson needs to get a signature on a contract, right? Those are all incredibly certain moments. Whereas the idea of like, are we on the right path for this product is an incredibly uncertain thing. And product managers, generative user researchers, people that do business development, these are all things where we're trying to figure out the rules while we're doing something. And so that's why decision facilitation is so important to me. Now, how much of what I do is because of randomness? I'd say like it's part of it. But I think in general, trying to be open to the fact that we are wrong and that we need to be seeking more information is a key kind of mindset stance, I think, for product managers to be good at what they do. Now, I think there's like a difference here between like product managers and project managers, which is like project managers are about safety, right? They're about the OSHA safety inspectors of the product world, right? Is project management. And they build processes so that we don't screw up in ways that really hurt us. But on the other side of that spectrum is like, how are we allowing for innovation and for allowing new unknown things to be created? And it's not one or the other, it's both, it's along a spectrum. It's just that like, I think we end up just creating tons of process. And I've written about this like with product-led alliance around product ops, that product ops is not just about this idea of creating process, but it's also about like blowing up process or pulling apart process to see what are the things that are really valuable that you need to establish. And so I don't know, that's like a long answer, but that's kind of how I see decision-making as fitting into product management as a profession, I guess, if we can call it that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. What else? I thought I saw someone raise their actual physical hand. Sorry, Camille, go ahead.
Hi, great talk. Oh,
Thanks.
there's so many, I have so many notes scribbled. I'm really excited to get some of these things going. One of the things that I do is a career education workshop for students. And I work with a lot of higher ed students, but also high school students. And they're really in the throes of, you know, trying to decide higher education, what opportunities are out there.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, I've read some about career chaos theory as applied to careers. I'm just wondering, just what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, this is where annealing, I think, comes in, right? Like the idea of, this is the advice, like the advice I end up giving a lot of people is like, when they're earlier in their careers, it ends up being like, what's the value of you diving deep into one thing versus the idea of experiencing a lot of different roles, right? I think the problem will be, and this is where, if you look at my background, I think it's very varied. Like whenever I talk to other product managers, they look at my background, they're like, wow, you've done a lot of like weird different things, basically. And so I guess what I would say is like, I do value that part of it, but it's also because I think naturally I am more novelty seeking as a personality, right? So I think it depends on the personality and the context, because there is like real value to people like diving deep and becoming experts in things. I think what I've found though is that, especially when it comes to product management, like I'm probably never going to be the next like Marty Kagan or Melissa Perry at product management, which are these like, you know, people that are well known within our industry. But what I can do, and this is where I think it's interesting about the theory around like, how do you build a career for yourself long-term is less about like, it's like people that become basketball players. It's like such a small number of people that end up getting there. But the idea that if you are doing multiple different things, like intersectionality, the idea of like interdisciplinary thinking and working, there's real benefits that I may not be the top 1% of like product managers, but I can be the top 1% of product managers that also think about the idea of like debiasing and the idea of artificial intelligence and the idea of like ethics, right? Like, so I can draw that line and become the 0.1% of that field because it's so small. Now, there's a balance about like, how do you decide what the size of the market is that you're trying to go after and the value of your specialization and things like that comes into it. But that's kind of how I think about it, is like, if you really want to be at the top of something, and not everybody does, right? Not everybody cares. Some people just want to make a good living, right? And getting good at what you're doing at that is like very valuable. So that's kind of been my thinking about it, in the way that I've approached my career, is usually novelty seeking things, because I feel like when I can combine different things, it ends up making me more successful in that particular role. Yeah.
That makes so much sense. Thank you. Yeah, one of the things we do is we kind of assess what's your personality, your career personality, we call it, and novelty seeking adventures. Or
well, and here's the thing, like, let's use this random constraint on this, right? Like, what would happen if you had to just go and spend a day like being a CEO, like, and just following someone around? Like, would you like that? Would you like the decisions they're making? Would you like the discussions they're having to have? Or would you like to, like, you know, or go be a librarian, or go be like, you know, someone on a ship, like, you know, on a ship or something like that? Like, I think that's why this idea of like experiential stuff is something we don't do enough to understand. Like, do we innately feel good about this or not? And I'm very much like, even though I try to pull a lot from like research when it comes to the way people, like, what actually is true about these things, truth is we still have to go with what is our embodied experience, which includes emotion, right? And so anyways, I think emotion and understanding emotion and using emotion as a way to trigger decisions is a really important and interesting thing. Can be done in a lot of bad ways too, right? Can be used for bad, as we know, with like riling up people, things like that. But I think there's really real value in like, how do you go off and experience things? And I've been doing some work recently about like pulling things from like the US Marine Corps. They use something called decision forcing cases. And so I've written an article recently about how we apply decision forcing cases to the product management field. And so what does it mean to like embody tacit knowledge, and how do you experience and understand that? And it's very hard, right? That's, again, going back to my thing where I said, first 2 years of your time as a program manager was like you're not worth much. It's because you don't have the intuition to do what you need to do, right? And you're doing things by the rule book or the playbook. And that is not what product managers should be doing a lot of the time, right? It may help you in some circumstances, but for the most part, you need to understand that things will not work out. Even when you have perfect decision fitness, you could still be wrong.
Is there such a thing? I want that.
Yeah.
Right.
Chris, I have a question.
Thank you.
Chris.
Yeah.
Chris, I have a question. It's Peter
Go.
Biondi.
Hey.
Okay. I'm a specialist in aviation, actually. And I spend a lot of time on airports. And I see a lot of problems in the industry because a lot of people make decisions in front of a computer inside an office. They don't know the customer. They don't know the users. And I wrote many times to CEOs because, hey, those people need to be here. I go to meetings and I say things and they say, how do you know those things? Because I go to the airport. I talk to people. I know who they are. So we became a world that people just try to solve all the problems in front of a computer, and there's no relationships anymore. And that's one of the problems about making decisions. They make a lot of decisions, they make mistakes, fix again, but they never go and talk to the real people, the users. So what do you have to say about that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I 100% agree. I mean, I probably learned this. I did a startup that was like an open table competitor around restaurant reservations. And we did some interesting work around how do you understand the way a dining room is laid out, how tables combine, which there was no like table combinatorics like science at that point that we just had to create the rules around. But I would stage as a host at our client or customer restaurants on a weekly basis. And understanding, to your point, like, it's not just our system, right? It's not like this website that you go to then understand like wait times and things like that. But what are the 1,000 other things that host needs to do? Like, how does that host rank when it comes to experience in the rest of the restaurant, which, by the way, hosts are usually the least experienced people in the restaurant, right? The dishwashers, the chefs, right? The managers, those are the usually, and even the waiters tend to be way more experienced than the hosts. And so what are we working with when it comes to not only like the starting point for how people are experiencing things, and then just like tying it back to randomness, like we were doing things in a very deterministic way, but we found that when we do something like similar to simulated annealing for finding the right type of like way we would lay out a night of reservations, we could find things to be easier there. And so anyways, I totally agree with you. I mean, this is not a discussion about user research and like understanding the context of people, but I've been diving deeper into like that safety world of like, I've been following a podcast around, I think it's called Different Viewpoints or something like that, about safety. And to your point about it, like everything that really needs to understand the human context needs to in some way embed themselves inside that system. And I do believe from like a complex adaptive system standpoint, like you need to be part of the problem to be the solution. And so that's like my way of saying, like, if you want to solve something, you have to be involved in the system itself. The times where people create solutions for other people, this is why we get into like NGOs not working out the way they do, colonialism, et cetera, comes from this idea that you are enforcing, like seeing like a state, right? What is versus ought. Like we should be doing things that are actually the reality of the world, not what we believe the reality of the world should be for other people. And so that idea of being embedded inside of a system, I think helps you see that way more. Yeah, thank you. It's not about randomness, but I do feel very passionately about user research and that type of thing. So yeah. Any other questions or thoughts? Does anybody disagree with me? Does anybody think this is crazy? I mean, it's a little crazy.
Yeah, I have a question or a thought anyway that maybe you could respond to. That you know, I think we've all kind of experienced how randomness and random outcomes, even really unlikely positive outcomes, can be really, really motivating. You know, to our detriment sometimes, and so
like a slot machine.
Sure, or virtually any app these days. Right?
Exactly.
That's designed to grab your attention and sell your clicks. But do you find that randomness is fun? You know, and that's part of the value in decision making, doing decision making better, because you're enjoying the process better, so you're willing to invest more time, and because it's more fun.
I think the fun factor is really important, especially when, like in the divergent activity, again, having people be overly concerned about getting it right actually restricts a lot of the capability to build lots of ideas. So I do think that there's something to be said for fun in general. I mean, there's a lot of things that I've been thinking about, over the last couple of years about the way we end up structuring and staging our workshops. So for example, there's a known effect that when you walk through a doorway, your brain kind of resets parts of like things. And so that's why like when you walk from one room to another, you're like, why did I come in this room again? It's because there's some type of real effect about walking through a threshold that causes your brain to like reset in some way. And so I don't know, I've wondered how we end up building workshops that move from room to room, or the idea of like sitting on the ground versus sitting in chairs. Dave Snowden has used this in a lot of his work around like the way that you end up giving feedback to people is have them turn away from you, and the person can't talk, but they can only listen. And because you're not looking at someone else's face, you're willing to give way more honest feedback, and they're just going to understand it way better because there's nothing they can do other than listen. And so I think there's all of this stuff about the way that like human beings, the way we talk with each other, the way we interact with each other, this has been built inside of us for a very long time. And so there are ways that we can hack these types of things to allow for less bias, less bad assumptions, things like that. And again, randomness is one. I think adversarial thinking is another. And I think these other kind of concepts around like, how do you build out, things that feel more flow, but there's going to be a time when actually you don't want people to feel fun, right? Like when you're making a hard decision and you feel like you haven't searched every corner for something that's like irreversible, you want people to feel like the stakes are higher in some ways. So anyways, I'm definitely not an expert on that type of research, but I think that's where there's different reasons, there's different parts of human behavior and psychology we want to be in the forefront when we're doing certain types of things. And so that idea of setting up workshops and things like that to exemplify those things, I think randomness is one that helps us when it comes to adding more variance, right? Or considering things we didn't consider. Because like, again, the universe and randomness doesn't care what you think. Like, it's just going to come up with something. The thing you can skew is, of course, like the list of things that it is randomness over. And there, as you get more and more obscure, you end up having less of a capability for me as an individual to link it to what I'm doing. I don't know, I've been experimenting with like GPT-3, which is like this text creation tool that OpenAI or DeepMind created. It's DeepMind or OpenAI, I forget. Anyways, I've been using it to think about like, how do we do a better job of like domain specific random prompts? And so I think there's something there about like, some of them will be common, right? Like all these questions, like, again, on these trigger cards about user-centric things, I would love to ask all 60 of these questions for every user-centered decision I have to make, but I don't have time for that. And so just like pulling 5 out of this deck and then considering them gets me way further than I would have just like thinking by myself. And so I don't know, I think there's still a lot of work to do in like domain-specific randomness, how like provocation or analogy ends up working in these things. This is why like lateral thinking and like bringing other random experts that are not an expert in your field into the world like actually makes things really interesting. I've really wanted to set up like a conference series where you have 2 completely different industries that you invite together and you randomly assign experts from every industry to co-author basically like a talk. And I'm sure there's like tons of like amazingly interesting things you'll put from that. Now, the problem with interdisciplinary thinking and work is that usually neither discipline likes you or cares about you or understands you. And so there's a real issue about that too. So I'm not going to say that this is like an easy path to hoe, but like it's one that I think is interesting for me at least.
Sure, we could try economics and psychology, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe that's been done.
Exactly. So
Okay.
Interdisciplinary thinking is lonely and hard, but I think it also tends to usually bring up the most interesting and novel solutions to things.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. I think it's time to, this is fascinating, but I think it's about time to kind of bring this closer to a close. And thank you for sharing your email and your Twitter handle so we can follow your work. That's awesome. We're working on our next events in March, April, and May, but if anyone in the audience has a suggestion, wants to nominate someone, in fact, I'm inspired to say, you know what? If if we don't lock in a speaker by the end of the 3rd week in February, I'm going to pick a member at random to speak for us, to speak to us, right? Because I mean, you all have like interesting things to say, so Yeah, maybe.
I mean, this is, yeah, and this is the thing too, is like, I think
Yeah.
one thing that you may want to think about for that is adding a prompt to it. Because adding a prompt and then like maybe picking 4 people to do lightning talks, it lowers the stakes a bit and could be a way to do that. Anyways, I think there's something really interesting. Again, we have to make it so that like randomness is easy for people to parse, but to your point, I mean, I think that's a great idea. I definitely endorse that idea. So
No surprise. No surprise there. Okay. All right. So it's just left for me to say thank you to the Borough Manhattan Community College for allowing me to use their Pro Zoom account and to bring you all together. And I want to thank, again, Chris Butler, thank you so much for just being so generous with your time and sharing your ideas and thoughts on randomness and decision-making and debiasing. I think that's really awesome. So
thank you. No,
if we
thank
could
you
all
everybody for listening.
unmute and give them a round of applause.
Thank you.
And
Thank you for being my guinea pigs for this new randomization of sections and everything. It was great.
Yes, yes. And I have one more request, which is if you enjoyed today's talk and what we do for you for free, can we rely on your reciprocation bias to I put a link in the chat. I'll do it again here. Yeah. This is a link for donating whatever amount to the Borough Manhattan Community College student fund, or COVID-19 relief fund, or scholarship fund, or whatever speaks to you. So please take a look at that and donate what you can. And thank you again, everyone, for joining. Stay tuned. We'll figure out our next event, hopefully within the next few weeks. Stay well.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you.